Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and you're all very welcome here to this very special place. I'm very privileged to have been invited to address you, and I'm going to start basically with a definition. If David would just turn the first one, just to give you an indication. Now, this is a responsibility to protect. It's known by the acronym R2P. And this is a global political commitment which was endorsed by all member states of the United Nations at the 2005 World Summit in order to address its four key concerns to prevent genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Now, I'm going to address you tonight on this issue that has and continues to cause much debate in the international arena of diplomacy and politics. It is the dilemma of sovereignty over intervention. Sovereignty of a nation is when it has its own independence, its own government, and it is led by a leader. Intervention is something that's done by the international community for a particular reason, and we have to ask the question, why might this be necessary? So, taking the theme of the overall series of lectures here on peripherality and centrality, I am chancing that I'm going to go with sovereignty as the peripherality and intervention as the centrality. Now, I will start by referring to my own experience in Bosnia-Herzegovina during 1992, when initially I worked with the European Community Monitor Mission in Sarajevo and subsequently worked for Peter Carrington, who'd been recently appointed chairman of the International Peace Conference on Yugoslavia. Now, on the 20th of March 2016, the United Nations International War Crimes Tribunal, based in The Hague, issued its judgment in the case of Radovan Karadzic, the former leader of the Bosnian Serbs. The accused stood trial on 11 counts, 2 counts of genocide, 5 counts of crimes against humanity, including murder, extermination, deportation, and the forcible transfer, plus 4 counts of violations against the laws and the customs of war. These were acts of violence of which the primary purpose was to spread terror amongst the civilian population and the taking of hostages. In the indictment, the prosecution alleged that the accused had participated in 4 joint criminal exercises. These included the shelling of the civilian population of Sarajevo, the hostage taking of over 200 United Nations peacekeepers, and the elimination of the Bosnian Muslims in the town of Srebrenica. Now, as you may know, he was found guilty of 10 of the 11 counts and sentenced to 40 years in prison. I appeared as a witness for the prosecution and was cross-examined him directly for 3 days. The trial chamber at that time in that trial sat for 499 trial days, heard witnesses or heard evidence from 434 witnesses. There were 11,469 exhibits, and the trial record came to over 330,000 pages. I had spent 4 days in court, and I had agreed to meet Karadzic in his cell prior to my testimony. I found it a daunting exercise. I had asked Karadzic on more than one occasion, be it in the city of Sarajevo or in his prison, why so many Muslims were slaughtered, and his meek reply on each occasion was the same: I'm only protecting my Serbs. Now, I'll give you one example of this. 3 weeks ago, I was in Sarajevo with my wife, and I was there to do a television documentary on my time in Bosnia. and as a consequence of a memoir which I wrote called Witness to War Crimes, which John has there with him. And on the second day I was there, I was taken in a van up towards a mountain retreat of Tribunal. And I came to an abandoned restaurant that I had one or two lovely meals in 1992. It was now a ruin. It had been destroyed by the Bosnian Serbs, but it became a favored sniper position. So I stood in that site and I looked down on the city of Sarajevo, which I could see in its completed form about 5 kilometers. And if you had a sniper who was located in that site, he would aim at the citizen of Sarajevo. This sniper, who would have been a Serb, had no idea whether he was going to kill another Serb, a Croat, or a Muslim. It didn't bother him. His orders were to terrorize the situation, the civilians of Sarajevo. And he was interviewed after, this particular sniper was interviewed afterwards, and he said, when I try to kill somebody, I always try to kill a child, because if I killed a child, I also killed its mother. On another occasion, Martin Bell, the BBC war correspondent, was interviewing another sniper, and he was asking him, how did it feel about pulling a trigger? And he said, well, I have the power of life and death. When I look through the sights of this weapon, and anybody that crosses from that street to that street over there, I can pull the trigger. I'll give you an example. So he looked through the sniper's sight, and there were 2 people about to cross an intersection. So he turned to Martin Bell and he said, you tell me which of these I don't kill. Now Martin Bell was really taken back, surprised, and he couldn't have words. So the sniper quickly aimed and he killed both of the civilians, and he said to him, you could have saved one of those lives. Again, he had no idea who he was killing, whether it was a Serb, Croat, or a Muslim. And that's why the civilian has become a target in international conflict today. Now, in the First World War, 90% of casualties were soldiers. In the second, it was down to 60%. However, in today's conflicts, which are mostly civil or interstate, civilians have become the main target of violence. And these conflicts are anything but civil. The civilians or non-combatants are now fair game. The proportion of civilian casualties is now somewhere in the region of 85%. And it is impossible to be accurate in this, as there are no means of accounting for civilian deaths. Over the last 2 decades, the world has witnessed armed conflict marked by systematic violence and mass atrocities against civilians that has looked to the United Nations to prevent or halt such crimes. However, the failure of these peacekeeping missions to provide security in complex crises and to protect civilians has severely tested the fundamental principles and capabilities of United Nations operations, which demonstrated that reform was urgently required. We have only to see the horrific images on our television screens from Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Rwanda, and Sudan. We've seen the indiscriminate pulverizing of Gaza by the Israelis a few years ago. Every day we see the result, thousands of refugees and migrants displaced from their homelands seeking a better life abroad. So the question arises, should the international community accept letting each state decide the right or assumed duty to intervene in another state's internal conflict, or should such decisions be collectively made by an international institution whose authority is respected internationally? Does such an institution exist? Within the United Nations, the Charter assigns this responsibility to the Security Council, whose permanent membership is so often clouded or influenced by national interest and rivalry. For example, yesterday, the Security Council talked in terms of what is going on in Burma to the Rohingya Muslims. Russia and China vetoed a resolution by the United Nations to do something about it, because these countries have great power in vetoing such a Security Council resolutions. And it really doesn't matter whether Ireland gets a seat in the Security Council next year or not. Once the permanent five decide they have the power of veto, then they have used it. So most will accept, apart from this permanent five nations, on the need of a reform of the Security Council, not only in its representative character of the permanent membership, but also on the quality and speed of its decisions, which must be seen to be firm, fair, and decisive. Can the Council in its present form be trusted in this regard? Recent events and my own experience of having worked at United Nations headquarters for 2.5 years would suggest otherwise. Now, in 2008, I was invited by the Royal Irish Academy to present a paper at its annual international conference in Dublin on this responsibility to protect. My contribution was based on my experience in Bosnia and the UN force, United Nations Protection Force, UNPROFOR. Now, this force was established in February 1992 in Croatia as an interim arrangement to create the conditions of peace and security required for the negotiation of an overall settlement to the Yugoslav crisis. Its mandate was to ensure that the United Nations protection areas, of which there were 4 in Croatia, were demilitarized and the populations protected. The force headquarters was initially located in the city of Sarajevo in Bosnia because it was thought that this act might act as a deterrent to the Croatian crisis moving into Bosnia. Its mandate was enlarged and its strength increased in order to ensure the functioning of the airport in Sarajevo and the delivery of humanitarian aid to the city. Now, an interesting factor there was I was in Lisbon with the peace conference when the issue of trying to get the airport came into play. The airport was under the control of the Bosnian Serbs. The second day we were in Lisbon, somebody rushed into the room we were in and said, "Please turn on the television. There has been a massacre in one of the streets of Sarajevo." And I think over 35 people were killed by a mortar explosion. And within about 5 minutes, Radovan Karadzic came bursting into the room and he said to us, "We did not fire the mortar into the city of Sarajevo that caused all of these deaths." Now, we knew he was bluffing because you couldn't contact Sarajevo at that time from a hotel in Lisbon. So I remember the chief negotiator, who was the last Secretary General of the Western European Union, called José Coutinho from Portugal. There was a man called Henry Darwin and myself. We had a quick discussion when Karadzic left the room. And the ambassador said, "We need to exploit this incident." So we took in Karadzic and we said, "Whether you like it or not, the Bosnian Serbs are going to be blamed for this massacre. So you have to give us something." And we said, "We want the airport in Sarajevo. If you're willing to hand over the airport to the United Nations for the delivery of humanitarian assistance, you will have made a positive gesture." And I can say I have in my man shed in my own home, I've got a copy of that ceasefire or that agreement signed by Radovan Karadzic. Now, UNPROFOR's mandate was further expanded in September to enable it to support the delivery of this humanitarian assistance. In addition, the force was to monitor the no-fly zones and safe havens established by the Security Council, and one of these included the town of Srebrenica. The United Nations force was authorized to use force in self-defense only in reply to attacks against those areas. Thus, the mandate was continually extended to incorporate tasks it was never originally established to carry out, and the notion of this protection force protecting anybody was not part of its remit. It cannot come as any surprise, therefore, that a large portion of Bosnia's population turned against the force and argued that there was nothing to be gained in protecting the delivery of humanitarian assistance when it did little to protect the citizens of the country. The very many Security Council resolutions passed during the period of the conflict did little to provide any degree of safety to the citizens of Sarajevo. We know only too well what befell the inhabitants of Srebrenica under the murderous intent of General Ratko Mladic in 1994. I can say here that the military command inside Sarajevo were getting bored with the amount of Security Council resolutions that were coming from New York when they had absolutely no effect on the ground. For example, the military command said that in order for us as a protection force to protect 4 safe havens in Bosnia, including Zepa, Gorazde, and Srebrenica, we need 70,000 troops. When General Ratko Mladic went into Srebrenica, there was one company of approximately 120 Dutch soldiers instead of 70,000 troops. So the military command said there's no use in us listening to the Security Council because it means nothing to us on the ground. And the mandate given to the force defined its actions and its limitations. It was hoped that the population would be spared suffering and that the conflict would not spread beyond its borders, engulfing them in a wider conflict. This fear may have had much to do with the refusal of the international community to intervene militarily in the conflict. While the brutality of the parties to the conflict, particularly the Serbs, was politically unacceptable to the eyes of the world, no nation or national organization, national or regional, was willing to take up arms against those deemed to be the aggressors. There was a complete absence of compelling strategic reasons. In other words, there is no oil in Bosnia. While there may have been much condemnation of what was happening and a concern of the conflict spreading, arguments were less obvious. Additionally, the conflict did not offer a reasonable chance of success at an acceptable cost. Civil wars are very difficult in pinpointing tightly demarcated enemy deployments. If you take the Gulf War was basically fought in the middle of a desert between 2 armies, straightforward, the good guys and the bad guys. Civil wars don't look like that. Civil wars are between civilians, Serbs, Croats, and Muslims, all of them Slavs. The Serbs will always argue that the Muslims, we are going to be dominated by these terrible people who have come from these Islamic countries, who have nothing but large families. When in actual fact, I used to argue, you're all Slavs, you all come from the same region. And what you should do is try and see what you have in common, rather than what keeps you apart. A legacy of Yugoslavia's guerrilla war included networks of hidden depots, command posts, and arms factories. And any intervention force would not be facing neatly drawn battle lines, but house-to-house fighting, guerrilla tactics, and attempting to take out artillery and mortar positions which were deliberately placed among civilian populated areas of the city of Sarajevo. As the international community did not consider direct military intervention as an option, the attention then turned to peacekeeping. The challenge in Bosnia was not how to maintain a peace, but how to get a peace. I'm of the firm belief that the Bosnian Serb leadership was very aware of the lack of unity or policy within the European Union on what to do in Bosnia, and was convinced that there would be no military intervention by the international community. Security Council resolutions counted for very little. The UN military commanders on the ground were not consulted. And with this conviction, the Serbs, while on the one hand always willing to attend peace talks, continued to take as much territory as they could, in the knowledge that the more we take, the more we can afford to hand back at peace talks. In defense, however, of the United Nations, it can be argued that the international community should not try to exorcise the feeling of moral guilt or frustration by accusing it of presiding over genocide, or by attempting to use the mechanisms to impose international will. I fully concur with the contention that once a military force has deployed in a humanitarian role, it is precluded by its deployment and rules of engagement from acting as an occupation power which can dictate its own military or political agenda to the parties of a conflict. In order for UNPROFOR to carry out the delivery of humanitarian aid, it required the consent of all parties who control the territories, and therefore it was essential that the force be seen as neutral, impartial, and non-competent. The force was originally established for deployment in Croatia and was not at that time conceived either as part of a humanitarian intervention force with a role in humanitarian assistance. The introduction of the force to protect humanitarian convoys was used by all governments as justification for ignoring the call for international military intervention. Looking back on that period, it is ironic to think that this protection force was not in fact protecting anybody. It was deployed in Bosnia at a time when there was no peace to keep or a ceasefire to maintain. When I was there, I worked as an observer, but I wasn't part of the United Nations force, so I could look at it from a critical position from outside. Now, it is true that for 4 decades, the United Nations has attempted to prevent and respond to massive violations of human rights abuses. And following on from the United Nations operational mission, where there was an unacceptable loss to life, finally, the UN Secretary General, in his Millennium Address to the General Assembly, posed the question: if humanitarian intervention is indeed an unacceptable assault on sovereignty, how should we respond to gross and systematic violations of human rights that affect every precept of our common humanity? The question was a challenge to the international community to address the real dilemmas posed by intervention as opposed to sovereignty. The Independent International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty was established by the Canadian government in 2000 to respond to its challenge. This is the report of that committee, which was under the chairmanship of Australia's former Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans. It was established, and the president, he's now the president of International Crisis Group and a former foreign minister. Now, this groundbreaking report was presented after a year of intensive worldwide discussions, with its central theme of the responsibility to protect, from mass murder, from large-scale loss of life, from rape, and from starvation. But when they are unwilling or unable to do this, the responsibility must be borne by the broader community of states. There can be no more Rwandas or Srebrenicas. This was the first document that suggested a move from the sometimes fearful phrase, right to intervene, to the more muscular responsibility to protect, or as it is now referred by its acronym, R2P. The concept is not only about military intervention, but it is also about prevention. David, could we have the next one, please? Now, this concept has 3 pillars. 1, the protection responsibilities of a state. 2, the international assistance in capacity building, and 3, timely and decisive responses. The next one, David, will talk Pillar 1. Each individual state has the responsibility to protect its population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crime against humanity. If anybody would like to put that to Bashar al-Assad, it would be interesting to see what he responds. The Pillar 1 there gives it a certain degree of, I suppose, ironic, because it is copying directly from what was originally said. Pillar 2 leads to the international assistance in capacity building. In other words, the international community is sent to help populations in need if further crisis breaks out. And Pillar 3 is to deliver a timely and decisive response. This is not necessarily military intervention. The movement is a preventative method for mass atrocity crimes when a state fails to protect its population. The international community, through the United Nations, also has the responsibility to use appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means to help protect populations from these crimes. Since 2000, all United Nations operations have been authorized under Chapter 7 of the Charter to protect civilians under the imminent threat of physical violence. This authority is often qualified by the phrase, "within your capabilities." This has become now the norm. In other words, when I was going in United Nations operations up to then, there was no responsibility for me as a commander of a peacekeeping force to protect civilian populations. Now it is part of your duty. You will protect the local civilian population within the ability and resources that you have, and that's a huge dilemma still. The reference to the responsibility to protect at the 2005 World Summit was an important step in this evolution, marking as it did the first time it was endorsed as a universal forum. The phrase "within capabilities" is hardly adequate wording in a mandate towards the protection of civilians who may have expectations that simply cannot be fulfilled. Recent UN operations have proved how difficult this issue can be. Some mission areas like Sudan and the Congo have huge tracts and extended operational areas as to make the protection of civilians impossible to implement. These cases are an indication that the mission mandates still do not have adequate capabilities to protect lives. The UN since this time has been advancing the progress and is still working towards providing a unified vision and conceptual framework to advance the concept to put it into practice. However, initial reaction from some member states are a cause of concern. For example, some have asserted that this principle of responsibility to protect is against or an assault on sovereignty. As the summit outcome acknowledged, there may be situations where the international community should not shirk from coercive actions to compel a state to meet its responsibility to protect. But the principle should be applied earlier, well before these violations take place. At the prevention end of the scale, the scope of a UN role is both broad and robust, including capacity building, assessment, mediation, and even a humanitarian response. If these measures fail or contain a situation, then intervention by other means may be necessary. And these measures may include political, economic, or judicial steps. But only in extreme circumstances would military intervention be considered. What of Russia's recent intervention in Ukraine? Could this have been regarded as a responsibility to protect, or was it simply a warning shot across NATO's bows? Little wonder the concept has some detractors. Kofi Annan repeatedly spoke of his determination to translate this concept from words to deeds. We must bring all of our resources to bear: early warning, technical assistance, peacemaking, diplomacy, and if necessary, military strength. A United Nations Special Advisor on the responsibility to protect leads the conceptual, political, and institutional development, while the UN Special Advisor on the prevention of genocide acts as a catalyst to raise awareness and the causes and dynamics of genocide. The mandates of these two are distinct but complementary and are primed to enhance the UN to prevent such crimes, including their incitement, working with member states, regional and sub-regional arrangements, and civil society. Despite a sea change in relation to this concept, its practical application has, in my view, been very limited. Now, moving from theory to practice, I did some research how the issue of this responsibility to protect has been effective or otherwise in various operational settings. So let's have a quick look. I've taken the examples of Kenya 2008, Ivory Coast 2011, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Myanmar, which was known formerly as Burma. In relation to Kenya, ethnic violence arose in Kenya when a disputed presidential election turned sour, resulting in over 1,000 deaths and displacement of nearly 500,000 inhabitants. The former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan was accepted, however, by both sides as a mediator, and he succeeded in persuading both sides into signing a power-sharing agreement. This was praised by Human Rights Watch as a model of diplomatic action under the principle of protection. The verdict: success. The Ivory Coast in 2011. Again, this was another presidential election crisis resulting in gross violations of human rights. However, in Côte d'Ivoire, or as we call it, Ivory Coast, there was an existing United Nations mission already in place. And it commenced a military operation which ensured the arrest, in this case, of the defeated candidate. He was arrested and handed over to the International Criminal Court in The Hague to face charges of crimes against humanity. The verdict: successful. Libya, 2011. Libya was the first case where the UN Security Council authorized a military intervention citing responsibility to protect. Deploring what it called the gross and systematic violation of human rights, the UN imposed international sanctions and referred the situation to the International Criminal Court. The Security Council also authorized member states to take all necessary action to prevent civilians under threat of attack in a country where excluding a foreign occupation force of any form or any part of Libyan territory. A few days later, acting on the resolution, NATO aircraft began striking at Gaddafi's forces. NATO subsequently came under scrutiny for its behavior, however, during the airstrikes. Concern included the fact that the intervention force quickly moved to regime change, and there were allegations regarding aerial bombing that may have caused collateral damage. Verdict: questionable. Syria. Since the beginning of this civil war in 2011, 500,000 people have lost their lives. As of June this year, there were 5.6 million Syrian refugees and at least 6.6 million internally displaced people. the largest number of people displaced by any conflict in the world. A further 13.1 million remain in dire need of humanitarian assistance. Despite calls for the situation to be referred to the International Criminal Court, little has been achieved. The Security Council has failed to adequately respond. There have been now 23 Security Council resolutions on humanitarian access, peace talks, and chemical weapons, none of which have been implemented. Russia and China have jointly vetoed 6 of these Security Council resolutions, and Russia has independently vetoed a further 6 resolutions. There have been demands that there must be unimpeded humanitarian access to all civilians trapped throughout Syria. Russia, Iran, and Lebanon's Hezbollah must cease enabling the crimes of the Syrian government. Those countries opposed to the rule of President Bashar al-Assad must withdraw all support for armed groups that commit war crimes. Now, some of you may be familiar with the 3-week program that has been on BBC Two, which concluded last night on the House of Assad. So the overall verdict of this responsibility to protect is abject failure. Yemen, also in the news last week. Mass atrocity crimes are being committed in Yemen as pro-government forces and a regional military coalition led by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, with material support from the United States, Britain and France, are fighting against the Hutu rebels who still control much of the country. The rebels are supported by Iran. As a result of the conflict, Yemen is now the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, with 8.4 million people at risk of famine, while an estimated 22 million require humanitarian assistance. Since an outbreak of cholera in May of last year, 1.1 million cases have been reported and over 2,500 have died. This is essentially a war between Sunni and Shia Muslims. All parties to the conflict have perpetrated indiscriminate attacks on civilians and infrastructure, amounting to possible war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Security Council has failed to adequately respond to the conflict, and we have to take into consideration what the alternative motives are of the United States, Britain and France. Myanmar or Burma, 2017. Atrocities committed against the Rohingya minority in Burma constitute war crimes against humanity under international law. These crimes may also amount to genocide. Despite its transition to democracy, Burma's security forces continue to pose an existential threat to the Rohingya population and other ethnic minorities. To date, 720,000 refugees have tried to get into Bangladesh to avoid the violence. This distinct Muslim ethnic minority of about 1 million have been systematically persecuted. The country's citizenship laws of 1982 have rendered most of the population stateless. The denial of access to the Human Rights Council fact-finding mission and the UN Special Rapporteur undermines efforts to independently investigate atrocities, and only yesterday it was announced that the recommendation to the Security Council to pass a resolution on the latest findings was vetoed by both Russia and China. Now, the ability to deploy troops rapidly has been a perennial problem facing the United Nations operations for decades. This is frequently acknowledged, but to date no satisfactory solution has been found. Many attempts have been made to address the dilemma, but the majority of initiatives have either focused on specific functional area, such as strategic deployment stocks, or they have been so general as to be largely ineffective. What has been lacking is a focused approach that results in properly trained troops on the ground within a short time frame. The countries capable of supplying robust assets remain very limited and less inclined to commit to UN missions. The UN would like to receive more support, but fulfilling the Secretary-General's desire depends on the ability of the Security Council to agree to the appropriate, clear and feasible courses of action, which must be timely and resolute. This must be accompanied by the forces, logistical material and finance necessary to implement any mandate which must match the realities on the ground. Many UN operations are deployed without the appropriate critical enabling assets being in place. For example, when I worked in New York, I was Chief of Staff for 2.5 years of the military division at the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. And we had a requirement for 6 attack helicopters for the mission in the Congo. The mission in the Congo was 1.5 years on, and we were still looking for 6 attack helicopters because no nation was going to give those to the United Nations. And I have never seen a United Nations mission yet deployed on time with adequate resources, sufficient personnel, and well-trained troops to be able to effectively do the job for which it was mandated to do. And that to me is a terrible indictment against the United Nations. However, in defense of the organization, I would have to say that the United Nations have deployed international peacekeepers to many areas of conflict where the large powers with the large armies would never dare to go. And the second tribute to the United Nations is it still, in my view, continues to be the one global international organization that exists in this world of ours today. So what has been lacking is this focused approach to give them the ability to deploy on time. Many UN operations are given the go-ahead without all of the assets to be put in place. So the problem is exacerbated in order to have properly structured, fully equipped, self-sustained and well-trained forces, the like of which are found in few countries. And then again we have the limitations. Now I've listed a few of those limitations and they are reality. Some countries are less than enthusiastic about going with the concept of protection civilians. Internal conflicts are notoriously difficult to monitor or to police. Belligerents frequently use civilians as human shields. I saw this myself in Bosnia, where the Bosnian Serbs actually captured United Nations peacekeepers and manacled them in chains at the entrance to their depots. And they said to the United Nations or to NATO, okay, come on, bomb us, but the first person you'll kill is a United Nations soldier who's been chained to the entrance. I have seen Bosnian Serbs and I have seen Bosnian Muslims set up military positions in civilian areas, knowing that if NATO were to bomb them, they would kill a lot of civilians, which is collateral damage. Attempts to protect civilians in harsh conditions with limited resources and with partners who often lack the will or capacity to do their part. This is another obstacle we came across within the United Nations. When you have the United Nations force that says, we want 10,000 troops, the UN will go to the membership of the United Nations looking for 10,000 troops. And they will be given by various countries. Some countries well developed, some countries not so well developed. How do we judge the standard of training of member states of the United Nations? When I was in New York, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, she was a French woman called Madame Frechette. She was sent to all existing United Nations missions on the ground to talk about the zero tolerance of sexual abuse. Now, some of this happened in countries where poor people would parade their daughters in front of the United Nations position, encouraging soldiers to pay for sexual favors with their daughters because they were in dire poverty. So the United Nations set up a very strict code of conduct. And I remember having ambassadors taken in to my boss's office, who was a 3-star Indian general, to ask them to explain, why do we allow your soldiers to carry out these acts when they wear the uniform of the United Nations? And ambassadors have said, this is common practice in my country. This is actually tolerable. So the standard of training and the standard of deployment and courtesy by membership of the United Nations can greatly vary from country to country. And this is a dilemma that still exists. So, the United Nations General Assembly held a plenary meeting of this concept of protection in July of this year as part of the formal agenda in its 72nd session. The debate constituted the first formal consideration of the responsibility to protect since 2009. While there was broad conceptual agreement on the principle, it was evident that there continues to be a great divide between theory and practice. Currently, there are 68 million people displaced globally as a result of conflict, war, and persecution. Many member states expressed concern about the growing number of mass atrocity victims worldwide and about the weakening of all international norms that safeguard humanity. The translation of early warning into early action remains a challenge. And as the UN Secretary General emphasized exactly 6 weeks ago when he said the following: at this time of extreme challenges, we must not abandon the responsibility to protect or leave it in a state of suspended animation. Finally articulated in words, but breached time and time again in practice. Lofty principles mean little if they cannot be applied when they matter most. The credibility of the international community and above all the lives of millions rest on us. Now, I saw some harsh action in Sarajevo when I was working there in 1992. But I think one of the most harrowing photographs I saw was of a woman in a forest outside Srebrenica who hung herself rather than be mass raped by Bosnian Serbs. Now, you can imagine what went through that woman's mind as she tried to escape the inevitable future that she had of being captured and being raped. And this happened throughout. To see somebody, a sniper, a Bosnian Serb sniper, actually relish saying to everybody, I will kill a child because when I kill the child, I will kill its mother. We have to wake up to the fact that conflict nowadays is as brutal and as fierce as it has ever been. And this concept of the responsibility to protect has been now in vogue since 2000, 18 years ago. So my final sentence is to repeat what I said at the presentation to the Royal Academy in 2009. The international community has a responsibility to protect the world's population from genocide, massive human rights abuses, and further humanitarian crisis. The direction of change is clear-cut. Further progress will require a political will, a commitment to change, and a determination to act. The task now is to bring the General Assembly's endorsement of R2P to reality. This is a challenge yet to be overcome, and sadly it is as true today as it was 10 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention, and now we'll take comments or questions.
In preparation for today's event, I bought this book written by Colm as a witness to war crimes, not only once, but twice, because I lost my first copy last Friday and I buy a second one in Galway on Monday. Having read it, or most of it, to say the least, he has met some very interesting people in his career, focusing particularly on the Bosnian and Balkan crisis, the likes of Henry Darwin, who was Charles Darwin's great-grandson, Lord Peter Harrington, Martin Bell, that man in the white suit who was in every war on behalf of the BBC reporting, and many Balkan warlords too. I'd say one more unpleasant than the next. If, like you, my experience of the Bosnian War in the early 90s was from the comfort and security of our own home, watching it on TV in the early 90s, and then later the Kosovo crisis in '99 on television, coming across for the first time to my ears that sanitized phrase, the now more chilling ethnic cleansing, having never heard it used before. And also in a land where the names are unpronounceable. And I thought your pronunciation for all those Bosnian words and names is excellent. I have two questions for you. The easy one first, and a bit more tricky one second. The first one is, Lord Peter Harrington was an ex-soldier himself. What was he like to work for or with in your role? And secondly, you rightly in your book, it came across to me, the kind of cleft you're in, that you have to deal with these most awkward of people, warlords, generals, politicians, and the warring tribes. And you say to make your job successful, you have to be trustworthy and impartial, or else you don't succeed. And that's one of the reasons you did, because all sides, good, bad, and the ugly, saw you as that. And that's needed. And yet, how can you do that regardless of you knowing the kind of atrocities that some of these people actually did, and you still deal with them day after day, week after week? So,
well, the first thing is that thank you for the way I pronounce some of these names. In fact, there was one man I came across who was the acting Prime Minister, and I was at some meeting afterwards, and I pronounced his name, and somebody said to me, "You pronounced it so good, you're here too long, it's time you went home." His name was Mushmir Makhmuchahayic, and so that one stuck in my mind. The first question in relation to Lord Carrington. When Lord Carrington first came to Sarajevo, he asked to meet me because he said to somebody in the President's office, "Is there anybody here who knows what's going on?" He'd been 2 days in the city, and he'd met the Bosnian Serbs, and the Bosnian Serbs told him what they wanted him to hear. Then he met the Muslims, and the Muslims told him what they wanted him to hear. And he said afterwards, "But they all lie. So is there anybody that knows what's going on? Who's this guy who's running the monitor mission?" So my name was given to him, and he said, "Well, I'd like to meet him." So I was given about 1 hour's notice, and I went down to the presidential office, and I waited outside, and he came out of the president's office, and he came down this spiral staircase, and he said, "Who's Doyle?" And I put up my hand, and he said, "Would you ride in the car with me back to the airport?" So I got into the car, and in the car was himself, and a man called Henry Wijnands, who was a Dutch diplomat and ambassador who was very much responsible for the original setting up of the monitor mission, because at the time Holland had the presidency of the European Union. So he said to me, "They tell me that you know what's going on. Can you tell me, give me a quick summary of what's happening?" And as a soldier, we normally prepare in advance. You get your notes, and you make them all out, and you have them A, B, C. And I was caught completely by surprise. But that was an advantage, because I gave him just an off-the-cuff briefing of what I thought was happening. And at that time, I had about 50 people, and we had them deployed in areas all around Bosnia, Serb areas, Croat areas, and Muslim areas. And every night we got reports in. So we were building up a picture of what was happening on the ground. So I gave him a very quick summary, and we got to the airport in about 15 minutes. 15. And he turned around to me and he said, I have learned more from you in the last 15 minutes than I have in the last 2 days. He said, I think you could be of use to me. So that's how it happened. I found him he was very well known. He had done the Lancaster House Agreement on Rhodesia. He had a very good reputation. To me, he was just a huge, a very important person in the British government. But he was extremely courteous, and he was extremely appreciative of people that worked for him, that gave him information which increased his knowledge of the situation. And he found, I think in me, somebody who would tell it as it was, I suppose. I didn't glamorize or dramatize anything. So each time he came back then, he would ask to meet me. And I would this time have a briefing ready for him, which was done by myself and the people that I was working with. So I found him very, very, very interesting, very appreciative. And I've often been asked by people, what was it for an Irish Army officer to be working with a British Foreign Secretary? He was just another man doing a job, looking for information to try and improve what the situation was out there. And I saw it as that. So there was never any area that I felt uncomfortable with him. So he had a great reputation, and I had no reason to change that for the period that I knew him.
And he was a soldier himself.
He was a soldier. He was a soldier, and in fact, his last, yes, and it became a movie after A Bridge Too Far in Holland. He was there. In relation to your comment about dealing with these people, I've been in UN missions before, and it's one of the cornerstones of a UN mission. You must remain impartial. And I remember meeting the Prime Minister, Jure Pelevin, who was a Croat. And this was one day after I'd been selected as head of the mission. And he said to me, we've got a problem with the Federal Army. They stopped a convoy of trucks coming in from Montenegro. And I said, well, why did they stop the trucks? He said, well, there were civilian trucks. There was tarpaulin on the back of the trucks. There was no manifests. We stopped the convoy to examine it. We found them full of weapons destined for the Federal Army. They had no manifests. They had no permission. So we took the trucks. And I said, well, have you discussed this with the Federal Army? And he said, no. And I said, why have you not? And he said, we look upon the Federal Army as an army of occupation. And I said, even though they may be your enemy, you've got to talk to them. You cannot make progress unless you talk. And it's a bit like, people, one neighbor against another, and they're all being stubborn, and there's no discussion. So I said, what you need to do is you need to open discussions with the Federal Army. That doesn't mean that you support them. But in order to find out what's going on, you have to open dialogue and conversation. So he said, well, my party won't allow me to do that. Well, I said, okay, what we'll do is I'll give you an independent assessment team, and they will open discussions on your behalf. And he settled for that. It's a bit like the United Nations in the middle of two sides. One side won't talk to the other, but one side will talk to the middle guy, who might be a soldier, or he might be part of the United Nations, and he'll talk to the other side. So we tried, because we were unarmed, the mission I was with, the monitor mission, was totally unarmed. So all we had was diplomacy. So we tried to use that as best we could. And you do that by, one, respecting the country you're in, respecting its people, respecting its culture, respecting its rules and regulations. And then you do it by open dialogue. And I've tried to use that all the time.
And respecting the relative combatants as well?
Yes, you have to do that. If I had a meeting with a Federal Army general, I didn't ask him to look at his map to see where his troops were deployed. Because if I did that, then they'd say, well, you're a spy. So we didn't do that. But we got the information by other means, and that was by openly discussing that it would be your interest if we had a better idea of where your people are, so we don't make mistakes. And by and large, it would.
Very good. Opening it up to the floor now. David, we have a mic roving. Gentleman here in front. Give us your name.
I'm Nolan, originally from Dublin, but in Limerick for the last 24 years. Thank you for a very entertaining and insightful presentation and lecture. I was in Bosnia, Sarajevo, maybe 4 years ago, visited the airport and the tunnels where the Bosnians got their emergency supplies in. And the guy was a young university student, a girl maybe 22. And she was describing the atrocities that happened, even though she would have been just a young child. Obviously, her family suffered greatly. But she described the snipers and the rapists who were still walking the streets of Sarajevo at the time, 4 or 5 years ago. And my question is, how many generations do you think it would take before the Bosnians can live in peace together?
If I had an answer to that, I'd make a few bob.
But just maybe before you answer that, could you tell the audience what is the current state of play in the Balkans and how good or bad is it? I mean, there's peace as we know it, in the sense we don't hear it on the news or radio anymore. So what's it like as you understand it?
The Sunday after I left Sarajevo 3 weeks ago, there was a general election. And for the 3 days I was in the city 3 weeks ago, I didn't find anybody who had any confidence in any of the politicians. I was told that the people who are going for election are already there. They were trying to retain it. That's all they're interested in. The population has no confidence in the politicians in Bosnia. The civilians just want to get on with their lives. The politicians simply want to hold on to power, and they really don't care. That's what I was told. Now, obviously, I looked up the result of the elections. In Bosnia, you have two entities. You have Republika Srpska, which is dominated by the Bosnian Serbs. Its headquarters is in the city of Banja Luka. It is led by Milorad Dodik, D-O-K-I-K, D-O-D-I-K. He is courting Russia. Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, was in Banja Luka the week before I arrived. They were opening a huge mosque, an Orthodox church, a massive, which was being built on the site of a famous old Muslim mosque that had been leveled by the Bosnian Serbs, because I lived in Banja Luka. So that's one side. Now, the leader of the Bosnian Serbs now wants to secede from Bosnia. On the other side, you have the Federation of Croats and Muslims. And the Croat leader, who has just been elected, he wants to move away, secede as well from Bosnia, but to the other side. The Muslims have been visited recently by the president of Turkey, Erdogan. So you see that the division lines are actually getting deeper. And one of the problems that existed under Tito, who was the great wartime leader and the leader of the non-aligned after independence, was that the way he dealt with the different entities was that he gave the weaker guy a certain amount of responsibility. If the mayor of a city was a Serb, he made sure the top Muslim was given the job of police chief. Police chiefs are big jobs out there. They're paid more than ministers. So he kept one side happy against the other side. But everything was just underfoot, not under the ground. And one of the last interviews I did out in Bosnia was with Dan Damon from Sky News. And I remember saying to him, in my naivety, I thought that the memories of what happened in the Second World War, which were still vivid in the minds of Bosnians, would act as a deterrent to it happening again. And in fact, it became an excuse. And that hasn't changed. And I do not see a great future for the people of Bosnia under the current regime. And the disappointing part of that for me is because when I was there 26 years ago and when I was there 3 weeks ago, 100,000 people have died, and there's no great change. And I think the big problem is, and the great sadness is, that the political parties of 1989 that came just before the independence were drawn along religious and ethnic lines. There was no major political party that transcended Serb, Croat and Muslim. So if you were a Serb, you automatically joined the Serb party. If you were a Croat and a Catholic, you joined the Croat party. If you were a Muslim, you joined the SDA, the Party of Democratic Action. And you were identified by that. And the second mistake, I think, in hindsight, and it's always to be good in hindsight, is that I think maybe if the international community had got some sort of an agreement with the Bosnian Serbs before it granted its sovereignty, that might have been something easier. Because one of the questions I was asked by the European Union was, we want you to directly ask Radovan Karadzic, what do you think will happen if Bosnia is given its independence? And I was asked to give the same question to President Ilia Izetbegovic, one Muslim and one Serb. Izetbegovic said to me, Mr. Doyle, he said, look, the Serbs won't like it, but they'll come round in time to accepting it. When I asked the same question of Radovan Karadzic, he said, there will be war. That's it.
Another question.
You mentioned your experience in The Hague, the International Criminal Tribunal, and the trial of the Bosnian Serb leadership. And you also mentioned the need for impartiality in mediating between warring factions. It seems to me that must be very difficult because one of the objectives in some of these conflicts is to ultimately bring to trial the perpetrators of these crimes against humanity, and yet these warlords are often looking for immunity from prosecution as a condition of entering into a peace agreement. Is it very difficult to reconcile these conflicting objectives?
Yes, I think so. The first time I went to The Hague, they were telling me they were going to establish an office in Sarajevo. And I said, well, are you not going to have a difficulty there in Sarajevo because, you know, the international community didn't intervene. And the Muslims turned against the United Nations in that they said, look, why are you feeding us and allowing us to be killed at the same time? Having said that, you have to start somewhere. You have to start somewhere. And 166 people have been indicted by the War Crimes Tribunal at this stage. Sorry. And so of the 166, they've all been convicted. Go away with that. They've all been sort of, so all the trials have taken place. There is no outstanding warrant at the moment on anybody in relation to Bosnia. They've all been taken in. Now, some of those have met justice, rightly so. Others probably have escaped justice. And there will be a lot of criticism against the War Crimes Tribunal because it said it has cost millions and millions. It has gone on for, what, it was established in 1995. The first indictments were in 1995. And it's now finished, but it only finished last year. But to me, to see a victim of the war in Bosnia stand up in court in The Hague and give their story is a great sense of satisfaction. And I remember when I went there first, I was told, look, if you don't feel well, we'll get you a psychiatrist and they can talk. People are very tense. Now, I didn't really have a problem when I went to the war crimes. I know in the book I talk about an emotional breakdown I had at the end of the Karadzic trial, but that was to do with my whole life, I suppose, centering around Bosnia. But for somebody coming from a village who's never been outside of Bosnia in their lives, the bravery of that person to be willing to go to a place like The Hague, to face Karadzic, is absolutely wonderfully heroism. And one of the prosecution lawyers said to me, we have seen witnesses come here from Bosnia and they're so terrified of looking at Radovan Karadzic, they won't even look across the court. To me, I didn't have a bother. I mean, I met Karadzic for 3 hours, just outside his prison cell before I testified against him. I was cross-examined by him for 3 days in court. That's 15 hours he was given to cross-examine me. That's a long time. And that didn't help me mentally because I had a kind of a mental breakdown at the end of it. So there's no easy answer to that. But having said that, the court has done its job because the fact that the court was established in the first place was an indication that the international community saw what was going on there was unacceptable. And what has come out of the United Nations Criminal Tribunal is the establishment of the International Criminal Court, which is a different court, but it's a permanent court, also based in The Hague. And that has to, in my view, count for something.
More questions? Anyone there?
This gentleman here.
The lady on the right and the gentleman in the middle.
Thanks very much. I found your talk really, really interesting, and but I'd like to ask, I mean, if the theme of your talk is sovereignty versus intervention, I'm very curious, obviously Ireland is a neutral country, and how does that place you in terms of, or, you know, the whole of Ireland in terms of taking a word, taking part in these kinds of conflicts? Do you think, we're always told that being a neutral country, you have to respect that you're already there in terms of the impartiality, and, you know, it's respected for that. But in the same way, could you not be pessimistic and say the fact that Ireland doesn't have, you know, a big arsenal behind it, or, you know, doesn't have a big army to intervene? In the situation where you have the extremists of, you know, warlords, they only respect force, surely. And if you say you're neutral, does that, you know, downplay your hand a little bit, or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting one because I've come across that on a few occasions. Generally speaking, it's to our advantage. Because we have no axe to grind. When Irish troops go abroad, they are neutral. They're not on the side of anybody, and it's recognised as such. And I remember somebody saying something to me at one stage about, "Ye guys, you're all the same." And I said, "Wait a minute, I come from Ireland. I'm on nobody's side, you know." I had another incident with the mayor of a Croat town who was in uniform and wanted to, you know, said, "Look, we're a bit like you know, your IRA struggle. We're a bit like those guys." And I said, "Are you comparing yourself to an international terror organisation in Ireland?" He thought, of course, I'd be delighted that he would be sort of equivocating that I'd be some sort of a supporter of the IRA. On another occasion, I said to somebody, "Look, if we had a vested interest, or if Europe had a vested interest in Bosnia, why did they pick an Irish guy to head a mission?" So I have found, in general terms, in my career, personally, the fact that I have come from a neutral, small country as an advantage. And our army has always been acceptable as one of the best images of peacekeeping abroad. Small, independent, non-aligned. We're not a member of Nato. We have a huge history. And I'll give you one example. When I was Chief of Staff of the military division in New York, I had a phone call one day from the head of mission in Liberia, who was a Brazilian. And I knew him because he worked in an office on the floor above me in New York before he went to Liberia. And he phoned me and he said, "Could you give me just 2 or 3 phrases in the Irish language?" And I said, "Well, what do you want them for?" He said, "Tomorrow I'm going to put medals on the uniform of our Irish battalion serving in Liberia." And he said, "I am so proud of your soldiers. Have you any idea how good they are?" And I felt 10 foot tall. I gave him about 6 different phrases in Irish. But he said, I want these guys to see that I've gone to a little bit of trouble to learn something about their culture because we value them so much. And that was a great sense of pride to me as an Irishman working in New York. So in general terms, yes, we're small. We're not a threat to anybody. But because we're not a threat to anybody, we are very acceptable. And we have earned a huge reputation for Irish soldiers serving abroad that the Irish public probably don't even appreciate. They don't have to, they don't see it. But I used to see it on a daily basis in New York. And it was a source of great, satisfaction to me when somebody would come up and say, look, you guys are pretty good. That was great. So I think being neutral, being small, but with our experience has always, in my view, been an advantage rather than a hindrance.
David, back in the middle, the gentleman here in the middle. David, up here. Second row.
Business there, and I had Croats and Serbs here for training. Now, I never experienced any tension while I was there. And when the situation changed, it seemed like that the European Union, or as it was then the EC, would take some intervention. But what happened, as far as I can see, was the first country in Yugoslavia that said they were independent, Slovenia, which one would say is, well, not irrelevant, but a tiny country with maybe 1.5 million population. So there was discussion about it then, but it changed suddenly. And it changed because the Germans, the government in Germany, supported Croat independence because they have had a close relationship over many years, and particularly in the Second World War. So I just wonder, what would be the use, or what would the EU now do if it's faced with the situation of a European country? We've seen it in the southern Spain, we've seen it in Greece. What would they do in a similar situation? Are they under any of these rules really to intervene?
Well, first of all, the monitor mission in Yugoslavia was the first time the European Union took upon itself to try and solve an international crisis. That's one. It could not have picked a more difficult challenge because normally in an area of conflict, you have two sides, good guys and the bad guys, the Catholics, the Protestants, the blacks and the whites, whatever. In Yugoslavia, you had three sides, Serbs, Croats, and Muslims. So that was one of the dilemmas. The second dilemma was that, in my view, the European Union was not sufficiently united as an entity to have a single common policy on what to do in Bosnia. And you would notice that because each 6 months, another country took over the presidency of the European Union. And whichever country took over the presidency of the European Union also took over the leadership of that monitor mission. And it all changed slightly. If Germany took over the leadership of the European Union, it would be very much pro the Croat. If Greece took over, it would be very much pro the Serb side. So there were always slight differences in emphasis. If this was to happen again, I don't know whether or not the protocols or the criteria is there. But Bosnia is now 26 years on, and I would hope that the European Union has got sufficient progress, both politically and military, because it has this partnership for peace. Irish troops now, Irish military officers work with NATO on the sidelines. We're not members of NATO, but we work alongside them in places like Afghanistan. There's also this thing called interoperability. We have military units here in Ireland that work with Finns, Swedes, as part of their crisscrossing so that we can work with them for future conflicts. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I would say one of the lessons learned is that if a unit or an entity like the European Union is going to get involved in some conflict, it needs to get its house in order and have a common policy that is decided in advance so that it doesn't keep, chopping and changing. And that's one of the lessons I would hope is learned.
Thank you for your answer. I'd like to ask you another question. In the Ukraine, which you spoke about just recently, the present government, if you can call it that, the government that was in place was overthrown. An elected government was overthrown with the support of the EU, the European Union, and the support of the Americans. What sort of intervention should have taken place there, do you think?
I actually don't know, because did anybody in the international community say to Russia, do not go into Ukraine? Did anybody say to Russia, you should not have taken over Crimea? On the political agenda, again, it's just my view, Russia wants to re-establish its global capacity. It's moved in, it's taken over Crimea, it's moving into Ukraine, it's now involved in Serbia, it wants to move in towards Bosnia, and this is part of Putin and his people trying to increase its influence internationally.
I understand that, but my question is, there was an elected government before.
There was a legitimate government.
Yeah, legitimate government before the Russians came into Ukraine. It was only after that situation changed that they came in.
Well, I think when Russia moved into Ukraine, the only way you would have stopped them, in my view, beyond political means, was some sort of a military deployment by NATO. The international community decided it wasn't going to do it. It either didn't have a stomach for it, or it didn't want to do it because it feared the consequences of it. I really don't know. But it allowed President Putin a degree of confidence that might not have otherwise been the case if there had been a strong military threat against him. But that's only my opinion. I really don't know.
I agree with you. I have just one more question for you, though.
Sure.
How is it, when is it right? Let me put it this way. The state, whether it's here or anywhere else, has the right to use military, or you can call it violence, in certain situations. When does somebody who is overthrowing the state, when do they assume that right?
Well,
Sorry, when they've overthrown the state legitimately?
No, the state is already is in existence.
yeah, and somebody goes in and takes it over.
When do they assume the right to not just to rule, but to use force in a situation like that?
Well, you see, unless there is a response, what are you going to do? That's the dilemma. As I've said earlier in the talk, we are bedeviled by national interests.
But I can see, I understand that. But I look at the situation that was in Libya. Before, 2 weeks before it was overthrown, we had the Prime Minister of the UK talking deals with Mr. Gaddafi.
Yeah.
And suddenly the place is overthrown and the West agrees with it.
Yes.
Now, forgetting about what went on in Libya, where did they get the right to support the people that took over Libya?
Again, it goes back to power, influence, national interests.
Might is right.
And might is right.
But it comes back to the United Nations. If the legitimate government has been overthrown, or
Yes.
somebody is trying to overthrow the government, what's the right? What is the rule for the United Nations there?
Well, the rule of the United Nations basically is if there is a request for the United Nations to deploy a peacekeeping force into a particular conflict area, okay, it has to be done by the Security Council. And the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, any one of those 5, and we know who they are, have a veto. And if they veto it, it doesn't happen. And that's, as I've mentioned in the talk, Russia and China collectively have stopped 6 United Nations resolutions in Syria. Russia has stopped on its own a further 6. So 12 of the Security Council resolutions on Syria have been vetoed by one of its own members. Now, why has that been done? Because it is not in the interest of that permanent member for the opposite to happen. And that's the dilemma with modern politics and diplomacy. We make appeals, but unless... I remember, for example, Peter Carrington was at the airport in July of '92, and I was right beside him at the table. And he was being asked questions. And somebody said to him, "You're trying to oversee the division of Bosnia into cantons." And he said, "Look, I don't care what happens here as long as the parties to the conflict decide it themselves. I don't care whether it's flakes or whether it's porridge." But he said, "I can tell you there are 3 options open here in Bosnia. 1, you walk away and let them kill each other, and we come back, we pick up the pieces. 2, we put in military intervention of a powerful nature, and the world is not willing or able to do that. And the 3rd option is to continue to do what we're doing: cajole, persuade, mediate, put in observers, put in the peace conference. And beyond that, what do you expect us to do? Because peace in an area of conflict must come from within. It cannot come from the outside. You cannot import peace into a conflict area. You've got to persuade it. And that's why open dialogue is essential, because it's the only way you're going to come to an agreement, unless you put in overwhelming power. Now, having said that, when NATO deployed into Bosnia, it did it with a powerful army. It was commanded by an Admiral Leyton Smith, an American. And he said to the Bosnian Serbs, "I am drawing a line in the sand. If you cross this line, I will cut your foot off. Do you understand where I'm at?" And Radovan Karadzic said, "Yes, sir." And he never did a thing. So my argument is, if you are going to put in a force, it must be overwhelmingly powerful to deter somebody from stopping it. But in your question about Ukraine or Libya, that didn't happen. And that's one of the dilemmas of modern diplomacy and politics, international relations. John.
No, very good. Next question over here on the left.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter McNamara. Good evening, thank you again. The phrase up here, the responsibility to protect, very good phrase, and all the stuff you talked about tonight is along the lines of doing that. But there are 2 fundamental problems. First of all, the Security Council is broken. It cannot, in many cases, as you've just given examples of, agree to do anything, first. Secondly, the resources available to the United Nations are pitifully thin.
Correct.
And therefore, it's really left sort of to chance that much can happen. So the only thing that I see coming out of the United Nations is after the event, you do have the International Court of Justice in The Hague. People are brought to trial. They are made to be responsible for what they've done. But regrettably, at the time it's going on, because of the 2 things I've said, there appears very little we can do.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, but the only thing I would say is that summit in the year 2000 was a world summit, and every single member of the United Nations, which means every single country, agreed with the principle of a responsibility to protect. But what is agreed in principle and what is done in practice, of course, are 2 different things. I think it was a development of sorts, but we're nowhere near the end result. And I know, for example, when I took a battalion to Lebanon back in '97. I didn't have the full strength. I needed more resources. So what we did is we did the best we could with what we had. But the difference between me taking my battalion to Lebanon in '97, and if I took that battalion to Lebanon tomorrow, I would have the addition a responsibility of protecting civilian life. And that in itself is a realization to the United Nations that we need to put the resources in place. But where is the United Nations going to get those resources? For example, the current US Secretary of Defense, no, this guy Bolton, okay? When I was in New York, Bolton was the United States ambassador to the United Nations. And this ambassador actually said, if you got rid of the top 3 floors of the United Nations, it really wouldn't make much difference. Now, the Senate refused to endorse his appointment, but Bush forced him through. I met Bolton at a reception a few weeks later, and I said to him, by the way, it'd make a lot of difference to me because I worked on the 2nd top floor of the United Nations. So it changed my life. And he just kind of laughed at me. But he's now one of the hawks in the Trump administration, and certainly I would fear for the future. But you are right, you're totally correct. But does that mean that we avoid coming to terms with the issue in the first place? Gareth Evans put a huge amount, and in fact the report I have on it is very clear cut. It's a very interesting document. It said all the right things, but the implementation of it is quite a different matter. And that is probably the greatest challenge of all. So I agree entirely with you, yes.
So what's the significance, Colm, of the 3 floors, top 3 floors in the UN? Is that what the
That's all the leadership.
Oh, the leadership.
Yeah. Now, I wasn't top leadership, but I was down there, but I just made that one of those 3 floors. And he thought it was quite amusing when I put it to him.
Any other questions? Are we all done?
If there's no more questions,
I have one final question. Colm, on Saturday, Ireland may have a new Commander-in-Chief of the Irish Defence Forces, the President. Is there going to be a new one or the same old same?
Well, I mean, realistically, the President, who's basically the Commander-in-Chief, it's a token.
I know you're not entering politics, I understand.
I got enough problems as it is without chancing my arm on the political front. But anyway, I will vote tomorrow, that's for sure.
Thank you very much.
everybody tonight.